that quality of willingness to do whatever God is asking us to do is essential on the spiritual path. If we don't have that kind of willingness, we can't progress. It's the willingness and being open to God's will that helps us to become in tune. And that attunement with God brings blessings and joy. It's what we want. But there's that unwillingness monster that Yogananda used to talk about that holds us back, keeps us caught in my opinions, what I think, what should be, and just this fierce energy that blocks inspiration. So that willingness is something that we have to cultivate consciously. Saying yes to life, saying yes. One of Yogananda's disciples used to say yes and make it snappy. That's the kind of energy that we have to approach the spiritual path with. There was a young disciple many years ago who was Swami Kriyananda's assistant, and she was very willing and able to do things. And she was in conversation, Swami was asking her to do something, and she said, well, you know me, I'm a willingness monster, referencing Yogananda's unwillingness monster. And he said, no, you're a willingness princess. Very sweet. That's what we need to cultivate. Be willingness queens and kings. Whatever God wants. Anandamoy Ma had a beautiful saying. She would say, whatever happens, it's all right. Think about the consciousness of that. Whatever happens. We've all had this air show over our heads the past few days. And the first day, I thought, okay, well, this is it, World War III. Growing up in the Cold War, you've been waiting for this your whole life. But then it's just a show. But you have to have that willingness, whatever it is, it's all right. There's a story that Swami used to tell about a sadhu in India, and this was decades and decades ago. First, sadhus, you know what a sadhu is. It's a holy man, a renunciate, who's given up everything. And the little sadhu was usually allowed to go on the train anywhere in India. Sadhus were given free passage. But then they cracked down on that and wouldn't allow that anymore. Sadhus had to have their tickets. So this humble, sweet sadhu was waiting patiently to get on the train, and he actually had a ticket. He wasn't illegal at all. But the train official saw him and thought, oh, sadhu. And he grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and hauled him off to jail. And he threw him in jail, and the little sadhu spent the night in jail. And the next morning he got thrown up in front of the judge. And the judge said, well, what happened? And the man said, well, by God's grace, I was waiting for the train. And then, by God's grace, I was taken by this gentleman here. And then, by God's grace, I was thrown into prison. And by God's grace, now I stand here before you. And the judge said, get out of here. He let him go. And the sadhu changed his ticket and got on the train and went where he was going. But the more we can think in those terms, by God's grace, every moment happens to us. Whatever happens is all right. I love, too, the story of Gethsemane, because Jesus showed so much love and compassion for his closest disciples. During a moment of Jesus' greatest test, he was sorely pressed. He knew what was going to happen. He didn't know if he could go through with it. He was praying to let this test pass and not have to go through this. It was excruciating. And then the people who were his support, his nearest people in this world, they were snoring away. They weren't any support at all. They weren't even praying. They were asleep. But did he chastise them? No. He had compassion for them. So let this draw inspiration into our own hearts of when people hurt us, don't support us, don't do what we want them to do, love them anyway. Love them, forgive them. Let it all go. Whatever happens is all right. Jesus is a great example of that willingness to do whatever God wants. Whatever it is, give your heart to it. Don't just go kicking and screaming into it and telling the whole world what a rotten deal you've gotten and how terrible it all is. Go with faith, with calmness, with love, with trust. We got to know one of the early founding members of Ananda. His name was Hanel Cassidy. And he was a great soul. He had been a fashion photographer in the 1940s in New York. So he was quite an interesting man, and he traveled all over the world, Japan, and he had stories from everywhere. Well, and he also started the organic gardens at Ananda Village in the 70s. When he was a fashion photographer in New York, it was a very fast-paced, high-energy, very intense scene. And sometimes these fashion sets would require a child. And Hanel would bring in his little daughter, and she would, go through all the makeup and hair and dressing protocol and have all this stuff happen to her, be in the midst of all this commotion, cameras and lights and yelling and props and sets and all this stuff. And her name is Sylvia. And so she was about 9 or 10 years old. She would go through all this commotion, and then she would walk up to her dad, Hanel, and say very simply, "What would you like, Daddy?" That's what we need to have in the midst of all the commotion of our lives. What do you want? In every moment, disregard, as the Gita so beautifully says here, shunning noise of foolish crowds. We may well be in those foolish crowds, noisy as can be, but we can be interiorized. We can be in the spine, at the spiritual eye. Swami says, how do we develop that kind of centeredness, that kind of willingness? He very perspicaciously says a few things here. He says, greet every circumstance by saying yes. Greet every challenge by saying, I can. Never mind the naysayers who say, you've got to be crazy, you can't do that. say, I can. Just like little Sylvia in the midst of all that commotion, what do you want from me, God? Let that be your constant prayer. Swami also says, in every circumstance and challenge, look for solutions, don't concentrate on problems. Always have solution consciousness. If you dwell on problems, they multiply. Dwell on solutions, and you find them everywhere. Just like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, I don't know if he knew the glory of the resurrection was about to be his. I kind of think he didn't. But that test was perfect, because without death, there could be no resurrection. It had to be that way so that the glory of the resurrection could happen. That's what we can't know when we're in the midst of tests. We can't know what that resurrection will look like. We can only trust that God is there and he will guide us through it. Swami also says, look for goodness in people, don't look for faults. That's a wonderful thing to remember. Look for the good. See the good in everything, in everyone. And what will happen? It will multiply, and there will be more and more and more of it. So as we go forth in this week, let's try to surrender more to God's will. As that beautiful line in the Festival of Light, which we'll do in a few minutes, says, give yourself into my hands. Then to your strength, I can then add my own. God, the Master's life itself, wants to help us. We are here for growth. The universe supports that growth. Give yourself more into the hands of life, and you will find yourself supported, willing, and attuned to God's will.
This affirmation that we did, the reading that preceded it has an interesting line that has a way of kind of sailing by us, and I thought I would repeat it. Man needs to learn to change his focus from what he is aware of to what he is aware with. He needs to become more aware at the source of his awareness. And part of the reason I remember these lines is because 25 or 6 years ago, I was living in Italy, and we were producing the first translated books of Swamiji's into Italian. And I remember there were 3 levels of challenge around this. One of the levels, the first level, was simply trying to communicate what did those words mean at all, period, in any language. The second one was trying to get them into good Italian, because some things you just can't say in a different language. It just doesn't, those words don't go together in that order. It doesn't work. The third thing was none of us knew how to publish a book. And we were trying to figure out how to not only publish a book, but do it with computers, which, if those of you who have long memories, cast your mind back to 1988 and 1989, there really kind of was no such thing as desktop publishing. It was just coming in. It was just becoming possible to do layouts in a computer and so forth. So it was an interesting challenge. But this learning to shift from awareness of to awareness with means we've stopped focusing so much on what's happening outside and we learn to focus on the source of our awareness. And it's an interesting thing. I remember in a series of interviews that we did with Swamiji, asking him, because a number of his books, the 14 Steps, the Raja Yoga course, which is now called Raja Yoga, the Art and Science of Raja Yoga, was originally called 14 Steps to Perfect Joy, and then it was later called 14 Steps to Higher Awareness. And Swamiji would use this phrase, awareness, raising your awareness, lifting your awareness. And I remember asking him in one of these interviews, Swamiji, awareness, tell me how that's so important. Because, I can be aware of a pain in my knee. I don't necessarily want to increase the awareness of the pain in my knee. And he laughed and he said, no, of course that's not what I mean. I mean the source of your consciousness. Where does that source come from? If you trace the breadcrumbs all the way back to the source, it comes from God. Your awareness comes from God. And all of us have the chance to become more aware of that source, but we have to learn where to look for it. And if we spend our whole time looking out in the world, then as the little reading on the affirmation said, the supply line becomes thin. I'm reminded of in World War II, Hitler decided to invade Moscow, invade Russia, which, they had tried that earlier in a different world war, and it didn't work out very well that time either. And you'd think that history would have sort of dictated, this is just a bad idea. But they did it anyway, and the supply line got very, very thin. They couldn't support the troops so far away. And then what really kicked in was the Russian winter, and that pretty well did them all in. But our consciousness, when it gets focused outwardly, and I suppose all of us have experienced this at one time or another, but there have been times when I got stuck on the internet. It's like the process just got stuck in an endless loop. Article after article, link after link after link after link, and it's like you can't say no. Okay, it's time to stop. When do you finally just turn it off? Or I remember as a child, sometimes the television would stay on, and we would get up on a Saturday morning. I for some reason like to get up very early, not for any elevated cause or purpose, usually to turn on the television and watch the cartoons. Well, if I got up too early, if anybody remembers this you got to go back a few decades, but turn on the television. If you got up too early, what did you get? You got the color bars or the snow. And it was like, oh, well, phooey. What good is that? And then, I'd look at by such and so time it'll kick in. And then, came the cartoons and so on. But sometimes that darn TV would stay on and on and on. And, it was like a kind of a drug, a sort of depressant or something, because it's hard to get moving again afterwards. All of us have gotten attached at one time or another, and we have to learn to release that attachment. I'm reminded of a story that happened at Ananda, and I don't remember exactly who was the one who found it, but there was a time when many of us at Ananda in the early years lived in humble dwellings, shall we say. There were teepees, and there were yurts, and there were tents, and there were, the really upscale things were little trailers. But, the yurts and teepees and tents were a little more common. And, well, when you have dwellings made out of canvas with lots of opportunities for things to get in, things do get in. And one of the things that got in was raccoons. And we learned, when you would buy your food in bulk, it would tend to come home in a plastic bag or perhaps a paper bag, some kind of bag. Well, raccoons would just have a field day with that, and they could find it anywhere. They could get up on any shelf, they could open any cupboard, it didn't matter. And there was this one raccoon that had just made a career out of going into people's places and just making a terrible mess out of everything. And so one fellow got the bright idea, it's time to trap this little guy and take him away 10, 20 miles away and introduce him to a new neighborhood and new opportunities to climb the corporate ladder of raccoonhood or whatever. And, well, the raccoon, raccoons are pretty smart. I mean, this guy sleuthed out, this is a trap, this is not, I'm not going in there. But he really wanted what was inside the trap. And so he got his little hand through the bar and he was grabbing onto whatever it was. He couldn't get his hand back out through the bars. And so the guy came and he found the raccoon. He might as well have been inside the thing because he wouldn't let go of what he was holding on to. He wasn't harming himself. He was not harmed. Even under the duress of this guy coming to pick him up, he would not let go of that thing. How many times, how many lifetimes have we gone through where we have grabbed onto that thing through the bars of the cage and we won't let go? It's just a human nature. Nirmala was describing it as this kind of stubborn fierceness that comes over us that says, I am going to have that. I'm going to have that now. I will have that. And we don't give that up so easily. It takes wisdom. It takes painful experience. It takes getting caught in the trap, or the same equivalent of getting caught in the trap, getting hauled away and going into a different situation. It takes the pain of suffering to realize we don't want to do that anymore. And Divine Mother is saying to us, and this is something we have to learn through our own experience, she's saying, I will support you, I will help you, I will give you what you need, but you have to let me. You have to let me do that, and you have to let me do it in my timing. And this is part of the lesson of childhood. Child is growing up and he says, but I want the ice cream now. No, you have to eat your broccoli. You have to finish whatever the protocol is. You have to go through the steps, then comes the ice cream, or then comes the whatever. And we will tend to not trust that process. The process of saying, but I've earned it, therefore I want it now. And life has a way of giving us, in its own time, the things that we need, the things that we yearn for, the things that we have in fact earned. And if we will accept that, and this word surrender is a little bit of a tricky one in the English language, because surrender, we usually think of it in negative terms. The surrender of, well, I failed, or those who lose the war have to surrender. Well, it isn't that kind of surrender. Christ surrendering to God's will meant that Christ could be victorious, meant that he could actually give the demonstration of what would happen to a divine being being nailed up on a cross and going through the whole process, whether knowing or not knowing in advance the outcome and how specifically it would work out. And all of us, at one time or another, we face the great unknown. What's going to be around the corner? What's going to be down the street where I can't see it? It's in the trees, it's beyond the horizon in some way or the other, and we don't know. We simply don't know. Faith is not blind belief. Faith is the active realization of, we've been through this process before. We just don't know in this exact situation how it's going to work out. But we've learned to trust, first in little tiny ways, and then gradually in larger and more intense situations. Oh, the universe really does support my life, really does support my growth and development. And so we say, okay, well, it's worked in the past. I'm going to take the plunge again. And we watched this with Swamiji time after time after time. I remember watching him go into the operating room when he was going to have colon cancer surgery in India in about 2008, maybe late 2007. And he didn't know if he would come out. We did not know if he would come out of that operating room in the body. There was no way to know. We had great hope. It was not that complicated a surgery. And I remember him waving goodbye from the gurney as he was being wheeled in and realizing, this is a free soul. This is a soul who can be here with us. And as it happened, he was with us for another 6 years. But at the time, we couldn't know. But he trusted the process. He trusted that God would bring him what he needed. Master would either keep him, or if it wasn't time, that it would all, as Nirmala said, quoting Anandamoy Ma, it would all be all right. All of us have to learn and grow into that surrender, because it's a positive surrender. It's an uplifting. I love in the Bhagavad Gita reading that this Bhagavad Gita reading is priceless. There are so many. It's not just the imagery and the poetry. There's just a heartfelt sweetness in the vibration of this particular reading. Uplifted will is one of the phrases that comes to mind. We have to learn to raise our will up to try to understand, what is God intending? What is the purpose behind this? Where is it going, and how can I cooperate with that process? And all of us have that chance, because we all face situations in which we don't know how it's going to come out. We have to do the best that we can do, but at the end, we have to release the results into God's hand and say, how you work this out, how you return this to me, how the next step plays out, that's in your hands. It's not in my hands. My job is, there was a beautiful encounter between Swamiji and the bishop in Assisi, the Catholic bishop in Assisi, who was very critical of this weird yoga movement thing that involved Christ in some way that he couldn't relate to at all. And we had been singing in the cathedrals there in Assisi, and our music was, people loved it, and they really didn't quite like that. So anyway, he called Swamiji in. Somehow they arranged a meeting, and the man challenged Swamiji. He said, "Well, you're not a Christian." And Swami said, "Yes, I am." He said, "No, you're not." They sort of was kind of like, "Well, I say you're not. Well, I say I." There was clearly no immediate solution to that. But the man said something to the effect of, "Well, you haven't accepted Christ as your Savior. Have you been saved?" And Swamiji very simply, it's so beautiful the way he said, he just simply said, "It's not my job to know whether he'll save me. It's my job to love him. It's his job to decide whether he saves me, when and how and what." That is our part. We can always choose to love. We can always choose to try to support and nurture life in this world. That is our power. That is our free will. What God does with it, how the universe responds with it, doesn't always work out in the short term. Sometimes it appears to be disaster. Sometimes it appears to it's just going to blow up into a nightmare. But the process always works. And ultimately, it always comes to some beautiful fruition. So let us surrender to the light of God. And as we do this Festival of Light in a few moments, feel. Don't just hear the words, feel the words. Because there is a grace that flows through this ceremony and through these words that can transform our lives. Namaste.